No, thank you. After. You want to test? Yep, sure. Yeah. You want a sound check? Is it okay for you? Level's good? No problem. Testing, sound check. How does it sound to you? There's a little feedback. I guess I'm a little close. There we go. Good.
I think we're good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Renee, since I need to go take a picture and I don't have time to go downstairs.
One, I'm Jay Wang, Director of the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's special event. To all of you who are joining us here at the University of Southern California, and to those of you joining us online, thank you very much. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge several special guests who are with us in the audience. Willow Bay, Dean of the USC Annenberg School for Communication Journalism, where CPD is housed. Thank you, Dean, for coming. And Barry Sanders, Chair of the CPD Advisory Board. And Goli Ameri, CPD Advisory Board member, whose generous support has made this award program possible. Thank you, Goli. And Glenn Osaki, Senior Advisor to the President of USC. One housekeeping item for our online audience, please share your comments and questions by using the questions function and throughout the program. Creating and maintaining relationships with key stakeholders is at the core of public diplomacy. Digital technology is reshaping how we build relations and how we manage these relationships. The Center on Public Diplomacy continues to push forward with advancements in public diplomacy research, networking opportunities, and professional training, which are ever more foundational to building trust in a peaceful and for a peaceful and prosperous global system. We're grateful for the robust support and the new energy continually being poured into our center to enable us to provide leadership and example for this expanding field. The Ameri Prize for Innovation in Public Diplomacy that we're celebrating today is an exemplar of such effort at CPD. The annual prize honors US public diplomacy professionals for creative and scalable solutions that advance foreign policy and international cooperation. The innovations recognized by the annual Ameri Prize not only promote the practice, but also further bolster the field at a moment when public diplomacy is needed more than ever. I would now like to invite the chair of CPD Advisory Board, Barry Sanders, to come up and announce this year's recipient of the Ameri Prize. Mr. Sanders practiced international corporate law at the global firm of Latham Watkins for nearly 4 decades. He is a leader. He is a champion of causes and institutions of civic pride in our Los Angeles community, from the arts and culture to parks and sports, LA Phil, LA Opera, the parks and recreation, and now to this burgeoning field of public diplomacy as well. So thank you, Barry, for your support, for your dedication. And please come here and announce the award winner.
Thank you, Jay. It is indeed my honor and privilege to be able to announce this second Goli Ameri Prize. As Jay said, it's a prize for creativity and innovation in advancing public diplomacy, and especially where the innovation is one that's scalable, can be applied, and make a real difference. And in that respect, we have a wonderful award winner this year. And that award winner is Alice Spensley. Alice is now spokesperson and acting public affairs officer at the US Embassy in Baku, Azerbaijan. But this award is for her work when she was deputy spokesperson for 3 years at the embassy in Beijing from 2017 to 2020. She's had a fine career in the Foreign Service, where she has been posted to Taipei and Kathmandu, Shanghai, and even Washington, which was presumably the most difficult posting anyone could have. And we're delighted that she's spending this week with us as an interlude from her work far away in Baku. Before she was at the Department of State, she also had a swing through the world of finance and Wall Street. She was a Fulbright scholar in Yunnan in China. And she's someone who went to Kenyon College and has a wonderful degree and great loyalty to Kenyon, as well as to all these other tasks she's undertaken. The prize is for her work, as I said, in China, where she applied innovative social digital analytics to take our many platforms and social media that the State Department had already and make them so that they attracted literally 3 times as many users and an enormously greater amount of engagement. You understand that in China, 100 billion people are on social media. couldn't even imagine saying that number. 1 billion people on social media. So the impact of this was enormous. And it was increased too by the fact that this was all done during COVID. So people were locked up in their homes and engaging with the work that Alice Spensley made available to them, and then also made understandable and scalable within the embassy and the 4 other consulates in China, because people could understand the interface between the work she'd done and what they could do and how they could, on their own, make it implemented after she'd left China and continue to reach so many people who otherwise couldn't have been reached or with whom they otherwise couldn't engage at any lengthy time. This is important work, and we are honored ourselves to be able to recognize it and give this honor to Alice Spensley. So Alice, let me ask you to come up here and I'll give you our award. Here it is. I'm taking it out of the box. It's there. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And here, let me stand here. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And Alice? Let me ask you to join Goli Ameri. It's her generosity and her commitment to the field of public diplomacy that enable this to be called the Goli Ameri Prize. And I'd like to ask her to come up, speak with you, and join us up here. Thank you very much.
First of all, Barry, thank you so much for chairing our advisory board. Much appreciated. Jay, thank you so much for heading and running our Center for Public Diplomacy, which for those of us who've worked and been in Washington, we completely understand the importance of the center and the value that it really contributes to the field of public diplomacy. So thank you very much for that. I cannot tell you what an honor and a privilege it is to sit here with you and to be able to talk to you about some of your experiences in public diplomacy. And thank you so much for this incredible work that you did in China. So we have about 15 minutes, and I really want to ask you 5 questions. So let's make sure that we allocate maybe 3 minutes to
Sure,
each of them so
sounds
that
great.
we can get all the information we can out of you. So your supervisor, who I understand was the Minister Counselor of Public Diplomacy in China, said about you, and I'm quoting, "Elise Spensley is the future of the State Department. Her application of technology to give shape to our foreign policy is nothing short of pioneering." So since we now know that tech and data analysis are so important to our foreign policy, how do you think public diplomats are actually preparing for this?
That's a great question. Let me open, though, by saying thank you to you and to the entire team here at USC. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here and to represent the work that not just I do, but thousands of diplomats do around the world on behalf of the United States. I think to this question of technology, I should also open by thanking my team. It was not something I did alone. We have fantastic local staff that we work with all around the world. It was a team of other Americans and Frank, my then boss, who gave us the space and the opportunity to take a risk. I think that technology and the world that we live in is fast changing, it's fast paced. China is unique and different. And we weren't sure what we were going to do, and we weren't sure if it would be successful. So I think that this opportunity to take a risk and to reconceptualize what we were doing using new technology is something that I really want to say. I really want to say thank you to my boss, but also my colleagues and peers who went on this kind of journey, if you will, with me. I think the technology itself, as was alluded to in the opening remarks in China, is mind-boggling, right? Where people are, reaching people where they're at with public diplomacy, using technology. I don't know for folks here or folks online, where we consume our information, who we connect with, and how we connect with them through mobile devices is just amazing. It's how I connect with my friends and family around the world. And so I think what we really wanted to do is take this lens of public diplomacy, recognize that we had a message that we wanted to share from the United States out with this audience. And we did a little bit of research. We spoke with all sorts of Chinese partners, technology companies, media outlets. And one of the things we realized is that folks, netizens, as they're called in China, are wanming, right? So folks who exist online, citizens online, were really interested in news content. They were interested in the world. So it wasn't that we were pushing information. It was, I think, using the skills and the mindset of public diplomacy to go and engage with people, to answer questions, to converse, and as was alluded, to really change that we weren't just pushing out a narrative, that we were listening and being responsive, to questions and concerns the Chinese public had online for us.
Very interesting. So I have a couple of follow-on questions to that, but before I do that, I also wanted to thank Willow Bay, the Dean of the Annenberg School of Communications, for joining us today and really for providing all the support that you have to this center. So we're very, very grateful. Two follow-on questions to that. One is, what more do you as a public diplomacy, foreign service officer need in order to be able to leverage technology and data analysis more? And then my other question, which is related, is you talked about your team. Clearly, you empowered your team to test and to take risks. And you also worked with an outside analytics team. Those are big steps in the State Department. So I want to know how easy or difficult it was for you to do these.
Let me start with the second question first, actually. I think the State Department, as an institution, of course, is a big bureaucracy, but within that, there are really motivated individuals who are here working on behalf of the American public for change and to tell America's story to the world. So whether it's a cultural exchange program in our Educational and Cultural Affairs Bureau, or whether it's our spokesperson who's at the podium answering questions from journalists around the world every day in our Global Public Affairs Bureau, these are the folks at home in Washington that are telling the story. So in the field, I think we have the best of both worlds. We get to be all of those folks. We get to work on educational exchanges, we get to work with local audiences and partners, and we get to take that wonderful work that GPA, so Public Affairs, is doing. And in fact, I think it's because of the talents and leadership of folks in DC that had started this Office of Analytics that we were able to reach back to them and to say, yes, we have 1 billion people here in China. Can you help support us to build out this new tool set? I also think that the question about technology and taking risks is very hard because in China, we also realized, I think we came from a spot where we had a local talented team, but we had to really do a lot of thinking and learning. The Chinese social media ecosystem is so different from that of the United States. So what worked in the United States and may have worked in another country did not and could not work in China. So I think that failure, if you will, that point of realization that these old ways weren't going to work and that we were put in a position where innovation was okay, was really important. In terms of the department, I do think that we were at a point where I hope that there's more resourcing to diplomacy, that there's acknowledgement that the work that my colleagues and diplomats do around the world is something that's important and valued. I also think it created a seat at the policy table for us. So it turned out, right, the policymakers in Washington were really interested as well in what the Chinese public thought. What do the Chinese public, how are they reacting to policies? What were we doing to do this? And I think that this question of technology by itself isn't enough. It's taking technology to this point about scalable solutions, but translating that technology so that the ambassador, so that a senior policy official, so that someone else can understand what it is you're doing. So just to give one basic example of this, long ago, maybe someone walked in, and they still do, I'll be very clear, all around the world, walk into American spaces and have an opportunity to engage with a speaker, an American diplomat, or use unfettered internet. But here, as we started this process pre-COVID, we could never have conceptualized of a world where people were locked in their homes, but we wanted to meet people where they were. We wanted to answer questions about the US. So we used the technology that was there to, frankly, deploy our meager resources. We only had a few people that I was working with and 1 billion folks to talk to. How do we decide where to engage first? And we really, I think, to this question about what we need, we really took to heart this conceptual change in the State Department about an audience first approach, thinking about, it's not just some masses, if you will, online, but it's a real person, or it's a real audience. It's a real chance to actually have a conversation and engage. We're not pushing information, we're listening, we're having a conversation, and we're able to then use these tools. And frankly, very basic tools. We started with Excel, and we started with, the Google suite of tools that folks are using. And then we built an interface that folks could use to manipulate that data and decide, where we should deploy. So very, basic stuff, right? If the ambassador is traveling to Xi'an, a city in central China, who cares most about that? Right, folks in Xi'an. And so then we could go and sort and have a conversation with those folks, maybe normally wouldn't percolate up to the top of our engagement because we just wouldn't see them with the sheer numbers. So it was really I think it's about the resourcing, it's about the support, and really about the support from the fantastic team in Beijing to take a risk and give us a chance to do this conceptually different work.
So you just kind of gave me this thought to ask you another very relevant question to what you were just talking about. And in fact, I think this was a point that was made in the recommendation letter for you as well, is that your work impressed kind of other departments, other divisions, other organizations. And I want you to talk about that a little bit. And you also talked about the fact that, you know, people in the State Department at the policymaking level literally started looking at the, you know, the reaction of the Chinese people, which I'm going to sidetrack for a moment here. You know, I'm from Iranian heritage, and clearly I'm very focused on what's going on in Iran. And one of the things that I often think about is we have not been paying enough attention within the mechanisms of the US government as to what the Iranian people say and want. It's sort of been a state-to-state relationship, unfortunately. So going back to the topic at hand, could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think that is actually was one of the most, to me, one of the very unique parts of what you accomplished, at least.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think it actually speaks to the heart of public diplomacy, and then it's those, you know, people-to-people relationships, and that, of course, that leader-to-leader relationship is so important, and we work on those visits, and we tell those stories through official media, through social media. But it's an opportunity, to your point about, you know, whether it's Iran or where I'm currently across the border in Azerbaijan, is this chance, though, to really consider public diplomacy in terms of how we tell America's story, not just to the leader, but to kind of an average person. And not that the person themselves is average, but what is it that that population is interested in, is engaging on? Where are these opportunities to tell stories? So when we think back to conceptually where we started and where we ended up, data is amazing, right? Data tells a story that sometimes contrary to where you think you start. Data tells a story that allows you, when you visualize it, to understand a problem set differently. Data allowed us to make an argument for other resources from the State Department in a resource-constrained environment to do these engagements. Telling this data story allowed us to work with a like-minded community in Beijing and convince others that this involvement with China was super important, that, you know, it's not disengagement, that it's this engagement. And I think that's truly the story of public diplomacy. Can you take a pulse of a people? Sure, maybe, but a lot of it may be anecdotal. But how can you engage and talk and listen and not just push? Or in terms of convincing others, you know, we talked about the policy, and of course, I've worked for, you know, both Republican and Democratic administrations. The work doesn't change, but the how we tell the story of America, what is resonating online. There was an example that I remember very clearly where there was a case, a legal case with a PRC company in a U.S. court. And we would have thought, oh, very sensitive, we're not sure about this, right? So it turns out branches of government, executive branch, you know, not legislative and certainly not legal. But the questions that were there and the questions that people were asking were much more about how it was possible that the US government would allow a non-US company, right, to ask these questions within our open system. And so we were able to have long conversations, not necessarily just about this case, of course we didn't, but about how the process worked. And instead of talking about this Chinese company, this PRC company, we're able to talk about the US process and openness and transparency, and that the US government, right, would talk about this in an open way and provide links and factual resources and pull information inside the firewall, I think was a really effective way to tell America's story.
Very interesting. So going back to the previous question, just for a moment, because I still have a couple more to go. Talking about the impact of your work on other parts of the US government, or at least on other parts of the State Department. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the whole department has recognized and has thought about data-driven diplomacy. And I think one of the real value sets that public diplomacy brings is that we understand those audiences. We do programs, we understand the need for M&E work, for monitoring and evaluation. Some things are really hard. You know, you send someone on a Fulbright 20 plus years ago, 30 years ago, they emerge as a leader tomorrow, for sure we'll take credit, right? But how do you measure that? Whereas I think with engagement in the digital space and on social media, you have almost real-time feedback, and you have this ability, again, to think about who you're conversing with and who they're conversing with, right? So you can go kind of down this data rabbit hole of who you talk to and what's effective and what's not. But to do that, I'll be real honest, you have to take risks. And I really think, again, back to that team, the team is fantastic and had ideas and we're able to listen and try things. It didn't always work, right? And sometimes some avenues in China were shut off to us. We weren't able to get an account on a platform, or we weren't able to verify, or we ran afoul of a censorship issue on something too sensitive. But by talking about America and keeping the focus on us, I think that other colleagues also who work in restrictive and challenging environments were able to look at that and see and measure success. It's also something where I think if you deploy strategic planning, and I had wonderful bosses who were supportive of this and mentors throughout my career, that it's not just that day to day, right? You're not looking for who saw that post, but how do you measure over time, or how do you do that engagement? And I think that has really been an impactful way for colleagues to think about the work that we do, again, in a social media kind of very fast 24-hour news cycle. But it's not necessarily about that. It's about the same way that as a diplomat, you might build a relationship with a contact or a colleague or a news organization, you can build that same relationship with a person, out there on the internet.
So Elise, you worked in one of the most restrictive media environments in the world. I'd like for you to tell us in your own words how you were able to work around the censorship and all the other mechanisms that China implements in controlling the free flow of information.
Yeah, I think the first place to start with that is just the realization and conceptualization that, we weren't in Kansas, if you will, that we weren't in the United States, and that we had to step out of our own bias and our own previous way of thinking in terms of how we would engage and work on Chinese platforms for Chinese audiences. I also think that we also have a Twitter account, for folks that aren't following the U.S. embassies around the world. We have fantastic content for foreign audiences, right? But who we're talking to is the audience in that country, typically some diaspora organizations too in language. But we realized that, again, Chinese population was interested in the United States. So part of what we did to get kind of around that was to think through what is a non-controversial topic that people are interested in and where we can provide information. There's just such a need, a demand for information. So we had really great partners in the State Department who would help us with translations. Some of it was something you could just go to. You can go to whitehouse.gov and you can see that. But truly, what did the president say about China? And if you want to be able to read that in your own language, from an unfettered source, as opposed to hearing about that from the nighttime news, right? We were offering this service. The other thing that we did, I think, in terms of censorship and content development is we really thought about, again, back to this, I think, public diplomacy lens of telling America's story. So we worked with partners, we worked with Chinese news outlets, we worked with PRC social media companies. We were able to partner with them. Of course, the environment is closed, but as a PD practitioner, again, we know that we have to work with partners. And so we worked with them, understood the limits, figured out with our partners what type of program we could do live, what type we couldn't, had great partners for events, maybe on a legal program with a university in Beijing, and then we could live tweet and take questions and answer them. Well, it wasn't tweet, but live respond to questions, and we could think about an audience in the room and an audience online. And so I don't know if it's so much circumventing censorship. I think in a perfect world, as an American diplomat, I would hope that everyone had an access to a free and fair and independent press, fundamental freedoms and values or something I've worked on throughout my career, and I think diplomats really believe in advancing. But I think you also have to meet audiences and people where they are. And so working in that constrained system to kind of look around corners and to try different ideas allowed us to be really successful.
Mm. So I think this would be my last question on this. We have some more time. So basically, through your data-driven work, you opened a direct line of communications with about U.S. values, priorities, policies, everything that you've been talking about. Can you kind of give us a quick summary of some of the responses and attitudes that you saw in China?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would also say, I built upon the work of everyone who was before me, right? So one of the nice things as foreign service officers is we rotate and we have this local staff who's there, but they had already opened these accounts. There have been brilliant, creative local staff or others that have tried, to get us the foothold or the toehold that we had. And I think that the response that surprised me personally was that we couldn't always predict what folks were interested in. You know, sometimes you think, here's this US policy, folks are really going to react in a negative way, or you prep a principal, maybe it's another example for an interview, right? You have a cabinet secretary, you're taking them to China Central TV, you're trying to think through what questions they might ask. Much better there, right? I could guess the questions from Central TV. But if you're doing that same principle and you're engaging with folks online, the variety of interests is just so different. And so I think what we learned most was to listen. And we would look at where people were engaged and what folks were interested in, and they would answer those questions. And by the reactions, and there were some negative ones too. I think this is also the power of the United States. We would have US policies that folks in China really, really didn't like. But you know what? We allowed them to make those comments on our platforms. We didn't censor those comments. We didn't close comments to that. So I think by us modeling that too, that we were willing to listen, that we were willing to be criticized, that we were willing to engage on some of these things, you know, that's not necessarily the world that they saw modeled in their own system. And I think that that modeling of US freedoms and values and being responsive, being communicative, you know, also speaks a lot to who we are as a people.
Okay, I could ask one more question, but if we're out of time, I'm happy to stop. I'm actually personally very curious about this. So based on your experience and your dialogue with the people of China, do you think some of the current challenges that we're having internally, politically here, are they been taken advantage of in China in terms of kind of attacking US democracy or not believing in US democracy?
That's a good question. I think that really the opportunity to serve around the world, that you get to realize that that perception is reality and all politics are local, right? So this question of what appears real or what appears concerning to someone who is a young, you know, professional in Shanghai, or a mid-career professional in Baku, or, you know, someone who's retired in Tehran, are all very different and all could be looking at the same thing. I think the United States system is very complicated. It's very messy. We're very open. And I, you know, to this point, you know, one question that came up repeatedly in China, so we were there during a couple of administrations, but during this administration, there was a question about how is it possible that this cabinet official can disagree with this other cabinet official? And at the time, it was quite public, right? It was on Twitter, as it turns out, right? But so again, there's access as information comes in. And sure, maybe the PRC would try to, you know, showcase that as discord or the messiness of democracy. Well, democracy is messy, right? Sure. And so what we would do is think about how it is that we give voice and what does that mean? And we could talk about in the US system, sure, you know, we actually have an NSC process or National Security Council process where the different agencies come advocate for their own positions. I mean, typically behind closed doors, and then you hear the outcome, but in this case, in a very public way. And that working for the State Department, there are times when we had a different policy position than our colleagues, and you know this too from your time, from, you know, the Treasury Department, or a different perspective from our colleagues maybe at, you know, HHS or some other US government bureaucracy. And so how do we come together to showcase that US government policy? And I think, you know, China can certainly, or other countries can try to tell America's story. But I think instead, if we embrace it and we talk about our values, we talk about democracy, we explain how that system works. You know, today is, right, election day, and we're talking about elections all over the world. It's very complicated. Which election is most important today on a midterm? Depends on where you sit, right? Where you vote, what issue you care most about. And so by being able to tell those stories, and all over the world, I guarantee you, my peers, my colleagues, you know, are telling America's story about elections. We brought foreign reporters to the United States, delighted. There's a reporter from Baku who's here, been covering elections in Arizona and North Carolina. We're having a local watch party. I know the communication school here will have one. Right. But I don't think there's one story. I think there's a lot. The plurality of stories is really America's strength. And I think that's very hard for a country like China, you know, to shut down completely. And so I think we lean into it. We use our public diplomacy to be authentic, to be who we are, to advance American values, but we do it in new and creative ways so that we're engaging not just with a senior policymaker, which is very important, but also with the people.
Thank you so much, Elise. I think now we see why your supervisor said that you are the future of the State Department. Thank you. We really
Thanks so much.
appreciate you being here. We really appreciate all your efforts on behalf of the United States. That's really wonderful. And I think a favor that I would like to ask you is please come back to us and tell us how the center can do more to, you know, further assist and help all you very young bright foreign service officers to do your job even bigger and better.
Well, thanks. My pitch to all the students that I'm meeting here today, and the professors I've already met with know this, is that I hope more and more USC students will also consider a career in government, a career in public service. I think there's a really amazing world out there and a chance to play an important role in it. So
That's
thank you.
wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. As we can see that, what Alice has shown us, digital imprints are everywhere on public diplomacy, right? And it's so multifaceted. We definitely need more energy put into, data analytics, creating a more agile system to pursue public diplomacy, and certainly to upgrade the content-based engagement. To further our conversation on public diplomacy innovation, this next part of our program will explore why it is so important to invest in building and expanding useful storytelling capacity, and how emerging platforms and tools create avenues for us to reimagine some of the long-standing practices in public diplomacy, and what lies ahead in the metaverse for generating new opportunities in public diplomacy. And cultural innovations often start in artistic circles before they enter the mainstream. And we have a special guest with us to discuss some of these boundary-spanning issues surrounding the next generation of storytelling and interactivity. So I would like to invite our guest, David Van Eyssen, to come to the stage here. Yes. David is a recognized pioneer in new forms of art and entertainment. He was among the first to create high quality and critically acclaimed dramatic series for the web, balancing the craft of filmmaking with the communications requirement of global brands. Working on the bleeding edge of expression technology, he is currently developing a large-scale art installation for XR platforms, involving a new visual grammar that merges volumetric and the linear media with game theory. So you explain what it's like. Yes. Right. His latest venture is Emotive, a concept and production studio creating emotional engagement in the metaverse. So, as I was reading your brief bio, and I wanted to use this term called multi-hyphenate career to describe your work. Basically, I think it's a very apt description of the range of professions that you have been involved in, and how you bring your talents to starting from as a painter, a commercial creative director, video game designer, series creator, writer, director, producer, and now as a digital artist. And in a recent conversation you and I had, you said something along the lines of that you have never been as excited as now about the creative potentials and the creative storytelling. And I would like you to share with us a little bit more about why you say that, and what are the biggest changes you have seen in creative storytelling.
So I'm going to try and answer this question in two ways, and hopefully bring those two ideas together. So, originally, the dramatic experience was probably a kind of revelatory, shamanic, almost Dionysian ritual, right? Out of which we've extracted experiences that we've increasingly commercialized, commoditized, and miniaturized. So if you think about this original event, it was something where we participated, where we were part of the experience. And over time, we developed theater, which was the proscenium arch, right? And then we developed television, which is a smaller rectangle. And then we developed, movies. And then we developed, finally, the little tiny phone on which we watch things today. That idea of the miniaturization of the experience also creates a distance for the user. The original idea of theater, goes back to this sort of Greek concept of theama, which is the idea of a vision, that you would have this experience which purified you and transformed you. Well, as these experiences become more and more removed from us, we feel less connected to those things. Virtual reality does the reverse. It says you are in it. You're not looking at it. And so the reason I've become so excited is I've been sitting inside of the things that I'm making. Just as we're sitting here having a 4D experience, a 3D experience plus time, I'm now able to do that in virtual reality. And the recall, the sense of connection, the sense of being present with what's going on takes me back in a way to those Dionysian rituals of thousands of years ago. So for me, it's an enormously exciting experience.
So when you talk about technology, how technology intersects with storytelling and the convergence of technology and storytelling, and I would say that technology and storytelling are always and forever intertwined, right? It's just the tools have evolved. In our current times, digital technology has expanded a range of possibilities in both the creation and the consumption of stories and communications. What are some of the important questions facing this issue, this convergence of technology and storytelling?
So when we think about, and we go back in a way to what the conversation was just previously, how much data are we scraping from these interactions that we're having with people? From a public diplomacy point of view, it's incredibly important. The more interactions you have, the more of a footprint you leave. When you're online and you interact with something and you add a comment, you are making an indent into the data in maybe 2 or 3 ways. When you're interacting in this 4D environment, every step of the way, you're making a data imprint. How do you behave? What do you choose? How do you act? How do you perform? How do you communicate? So this convergence of technology is actually creating huge opportunities, on the data collection side and the idea of the modeling side. But it, at the same time, and conversely, produces a sense of freedom. So we've got this tension between how technology is working to capture information about us and potentially use that either for us or against us. Simultaneously, we have the sense that we're actually participating in something, and you're never more free than when you're in VR, because you can do anything, you can move anywhere, anything can happen to you. You're in a kind of liminal state.
And so let's maybe take a look at some of your work. I was going to ask you about some of these visual inspirations and how, as you were talking about, technology is integrating storytelling and how it in fact also engages our multiple senses increasingly as you talk about the VR or some of the newer platforms. So tell us a little bit about the objects and the environments that you have created. What are the visual inspirations coming from?
Well, my personal interest is time and memory. I went through a period in my life where I had memory issues, and I began to analyze what in fact are we doing when we're recording memory. And it's the same question that we ask about perception. How do we stitch together information to form a coherent picture? What we're doing is extracting elements, and then the brain neurasthenically is creating this sensation of a real event. But in fact, there is no real event taking place. It's taking place in the mind. Everything that we're pulling together are simply strands of information which we tie together in our minds. That is a subject for me, because as memory deteriorated personally, I started to think about how do you stitch images together to create something new. So all of the pieces that I've worked on have really been interrogations of memory.
And how do you, as I was saying earlier about the multiple senses that the work engages in, increasingly we see how we engage the sound, engage the ear, engage the eye, and even the touch, other senses in these new environments. Yes.
Absolutely, when we're looking at something, this is an installation that's 136 feet wide by 53 feet high in downtown LA on the back of what was a hotel, it's a derelict building. People came to watch this, but of course it's a 3D experience. It's a 2D experience projected onto a 3D object. And when people came to experience it, they went directly towards the object, photographed themselves within it, because what they want to do is interact. You see, interactivity is the thing that's missing from the experience of looking. When we look, we're standing outside of the object. And so this draw towards how do we synthesize an experience comes from the idea that what we're really trying to do is to mix the senses together and to be participating in the experience ourselves. Again, this is the draw of VR.
Yeah. So one may argue that, the more we sort of inhabit in this virtual space, and the more we may even become interested, more aware of our physical, spaces. And there is a process of kind of a discovery or rediscovery as we're exploring the virtual spaces. And so there is a greater sense of open-endedness within the to integrate the virtual spaces into our physical space experiences. And so how do we sort of connect these different experiences in creating stories? To me, it's a huge challenge that to make it meaningful. Like, the audience can create meaning, can relate to that, can create connections to these hybrid spaces.
So let me just try and describe it in this way. And there's a piece on this reel which will explain it perhaps visually. If I take a photograph of something, and then I do a 3D scan of that same object, you would expect, because we have a history of 2D representation, for the 2D image to be moving and to be communicative. As soon as you see the 3D scan of that thing, however, the 2D image ceases to have relevance, because what you have with the 3D scan, again, is presence. You have this feeling of that idea of the vision. You are present with that object, and your relationship to that object changes your experience of it, because scale changes. Your space in which you're operating defines how you experience that object. That doesn't happen with, looking at a picture or looking at a movie or looking at a television. It's a very different kind of experience, and qualitatively, it changes your emotional reaction.
So I actually was curious about, I was going to ask you, as we, utilize more of these technologies in storytelling, how do we create these sentiments, feelings, right? This interior emotional life, how people connect with the objects or with other people, and how one may do it by providing a more personal context, so that that the story can be more engaging and people can connect with the story better.
So look, the fundamental difference, and the reason game theory is so important in the design of the metaverse, is that you're not sitting back to be told a story. You're actually engaging in the story itself. So that changes the parameters of narrative itself. And instead of having the expectation that someone is going to pass information to you, you now have this urgency to discover and to unlock. And this is a sort of game theory based experience, which draws you closer to the object. The emotional experience comes, and I believe that the metaverse must become an emotional environment for it to function. It can't just be cryptocurrency, it can't just be technology. There has to be emotional engagement in the metaverse. That part of what we're trying to create, I think, comes from the sense that you are confronting the object. So in the case of something like this is a scan done in a particular way by me to illustrate the gaps and the patchiness of recollection and time. But if you stand in front of that object, you have no authorship. You're looking at a window, right? But when I produce the scan of it, you have a mediated experience, which I can make you stand in front of again. The sense of confrontation that you have with that object now is far greater than I could create by doing a painting or by making a film of that same subject. It's now something that you relate to directly.
Well, what does all this have to do with public diplomacy work, right? So, but if we think about public diplomacy work, it is about storytelling, and it's about communication, and storytelling is the sine qua non of communication. Let's just suppose, for instance, one of a pretty standard public diplomacy activity is to host an arts exhibit or a cultural exhibit at the ambassador's residence, for instance. It's a very site-specific activity. And so based on what we've just discussing, I'm just wondering what your thoughts on how the convergence of using technology to tell stories, to tell a better story of this very site-specific activity in cultural diplomacy.
So you have to think of the metaverse as a topography, right? And it's a topography which we intersect with. It's not a world that exists separately from us, but it's one that we can literally walk into. If you look at the pass-through technology of Oculus, you're able to see the world around you, but you're also able to walk into through a kind of gateway. The metaverse. The metaverse is around us effectively with XR technology. So in an exhibition, you could have screens, you can have projectors, you can have all kinds of things. But you also have the metaverse sitting there right on the edge of the show itself. So people in other places could be in the metaverse, seeing you at the exhibition in that location, and you could be traveling into the metaverse to join them in conversation. It's all about how we interact with each other in a joined topography. And I think the great misconception of the metaverse is it's somewhere out there. Of course, it's right here. And if we're right here and the metaverse is right here, then the continuity between the topographies is complete. So that exhibition would be something that takes place not just in the real world, but also in the fabricated, manufactured environment of the metaverse itself.
Now, I cannot resist asking you sort of a similar question about how do we do a Fulbright program, for instance, in the metaverse? So what does that mean? You know, Fulbright programs, these exchange programs. What does Fulbright look like in the metaverse?
So, you know, the metaverse is a multiplayer environment. And when you have an exchange program and you go to another city or another country and you live with a family, or you spend time at another university, or you engage with these other people, there may be an exchange where somebody else goes to another country and does the same thing. But you don't get to do the same thing in the same place. What the metaverse offers is an environment where we can experience something together. That simultaneity, I think, of experience is something that Fulbright particularly would benefit from. Because if you're in the metaverse with other people, then it's not as though you have to travel, and you of course can travel to another place, but there is a joined space within which you can communicate. And perhaps post-Fulbright, that joined space becomes an area of dialogue and discourse, which you feel naturally wedded to because you've had this other experience. It's an extension of the real world.
And how feasible it is actually to create such a environment to extend the Fulbright experience.
How difficult is it to do?
How easy it is or how difficult it is.
I mean, listen, I'm working on things that I never thought I would be able to make. And the designers I'm working with, you know, their jaws drop when we actually make things because we're making things for the first time. So the fact is we have tools and technology at our disposal to do things that have never been done before. So Fulbright, of course, could be created anew. It could be reborn, probably more easily than you would imagine, because this is a process of unpacking a black box, and everybody who unpacks it seems to discover something in it that they hadn't imagined was there in the first place.
Any questions from our audience as we discuss? Yes, please.
So I'm going to always have questions because, oh, sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So my area of research always deals with the corporeal aspects and the effectiveness of corporeal, being an architect, delving into public diplomacy. And one of the things I've come across is that memory is imprinted when, like, story, like I was just thinking about Star Wars. Nick Cole's favorite movie. But to me, as a kid, I did imprint that as a story as a child. I love Star Wars. I didn't go into the movie, but I have that memory and I can connect. And I think that's something that probably the narrative element of the virtual realm, that part is still needing more exploration. But from my own understanding, like memory is much more easily imprinted the more you involve your body. So like the physical like choreography of the body through space, senses of the more you interact with smell, touch, taste, whatever. Don't think we can taste the images yet, but there's an element of the sort of metaphysical, almost like a ghost aspect that I think that could be explored a little bit more. I was just mentioning to Barry about this Walter Benjamin article called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which explores the power of the virtual realms, the technologies from the 20th century onwards, and talks about its ability to connect, to spread information, but its loss of aura in not having the presence of architecture or the art, or like the moon rock, for example. So I'm just curious what you thought.
I think I understand the question. So one of the things that you see with 2D interaction with the internet is a lack of accountability. So people can say anything they want online because you never see them. You have no contact with them. If I'm an avatar and you're an avatar and we incorporate our experience in a joined topography, there's a sense of responsibility we have to each other. It's just what happens when people feel that they're together. You could be in Azerbaijan and I could be in Tampa, but there's this sense that we are actually sharing a space, sharing a time space, which makes us account to each other in a different way. So I really believe that that physical experience, not just the imprint of being in a place, of course, the recall is, they say, 10 times greater being in a virtual environment and looking at an apple than looking at a picture of an apple, because you feel the apple, right? You sense the apple and you can pass the apple to somebody else. But there's also this feeling of accountability. And I love that about XR. And we don't have it in the 2D environment we live in now, much to our dismay.
Does that enter into this control issue?
Maybe. Let me ask you sort of the same question, but from a different perspective. I understand looking at a 2D image that I'm in a way to sort of, if I'm taking it in as a narrative, I'm suspending disbelief. I know it's not the real thing. I'm either taking it in or not, admiring it or not, but I know what it is. The problem I personally have with immersive experiences is I have no tolerance for imperfection in them, which creates a challenge in terms of what you were just discussing, a tremendous challenge, because the whole philosophy of it seems to be to truly create something that is verisimilitude, a kind of genuine experience, have the thing be experienced, not just looked at, as you've been explaining. So whenever there's an imperfection in any aspect of it, it seems to bring the whole experience down for me, whether it's a holographic thing that just doesn't come anywhere near close enough. There was a show in a warehouse, maybe it's still on, of trees right on the east side of the LA River that was very immersive, and it didn't work for me because maybe I'm the only one in the room, but if they're going to sell me on the idea that it's real, it has to be real.
Well, let me say two things. First of all, I operate in the area of imperfection. It's my subject because memory is porous, and I believe in actually crafting something that represents that failure of being able to accurately recall. That's my subject. So I'm okay with this idea that something is imperfect. But on the other hand, one of the things that happens in VR, and it's different from an immersive experience where you're looking at screens, is you accept that, in fact, you're looking at an optical resolution which is below that which we are looking at each other. It's below that we're looking at a 4K television set, but it feels more real. It feels more real, and you accept the level of reality because you're present within it. So I think perhaps the imperfections that you sensed were because you were looking at something. If you were actually in that thing, I think you adopt a different kind of tolerance, and your behavior and your interaction with those things becomes more important than how perfect they are.
Yes.
Hi, a really interesting commentary, I think, on XR and the way we experience it. I guess I have two questions at least, but one is just about digital identity. I mean, especially from like the nation state perspective, just in the sense of, you know, you have these countries like, I don't know, well, or places like Dubai or Bahamas that are creating actual official residencies or embassies, and like, what is, I guess, what's the point of that, or what do you, where do you see that going, and how does digital identity, you know, what do you think will happen with that? And just generally, do you have any thoughts on what, like, I think just from my experiences with VR have been really mind blowing, but it's a really short, typically experience. There's not really a great killer app yet. And so if you have any thoughts on what that might look like.
Yeah. So, I mean, well, the CIA has a website, right? And the reason it has a website is to be able to communicate to the rest of the world. The positioning of the CIA, right, is not actually to participate in divulging information about what the CIA does, right? So the reason that the Bahamas has a virtual version, and I think, I can't remember, there's an island where Zaha Hadid architects have actually built an incredible house, is to establish a location where interactions can take place. That's what it's about. And there is no owned metaverse. There is no real estate that you can say, I bought that plot of land that somebody else will definitely have access to 20 years from now, because it's not conjoined topography. It's everybody setting up different topographies all over the place. That's a little bit like having different websites throughout the internet. And I was very involved in broadband right at the beginning. And everything felt very, very separate. And today it doesn't. Today it feels as though you're interconnected wherever you are on the internet with any other piece of information. And I think the metaverse will become like that. What the connective tissue will be and who will do that and how many people will participate in that, I don't know the answer to. But I think your second question was about the killer app, right? So I think virtual reality is the killer app. I think once you step into it, everything changes. I mean, remember that the internet as we understand it today is going to become three-dimensional. It's going to become volumetric. Doesn't matter what anybody says about, you know, the metaverse is not real. It's not going to happen. The hardware isn't there yet. The adoption rates are not high enough. It is just going to happen, just the way broadband happened. It's going to become completely volumetric. Your desktops will be volumetric. Your devices will be light field devices. When you're in VR or XR or MR, you'll have all kinds of tools. The form factors are getting better. The processing is getting faster. So I think it actually is the killer app itself. What I make inside of that is, again, these emotional experiences, these things which you would see in the real world, or have, you know, you'd read a piece of poetry or you'd watch a movie. I want to make the equivalent of that volumetrically.
May I go next?
Oh, yes.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting conversation. Thank you very much. So I want to go back to public diplomacy for a moment, and let's agree that public diplomacy is all about informing, engaging, and influencing foreign audiences. So one of the issues with public diplomacy, which is what we've often talked about at the center, is at least from a United States perspective, we don't necessarily always do it on a scalable fashion, which is why the work of people like Elise is so important, because you have an art exhibit and it kind of belongs, you know, to the 60s, you know, only a handful of people watch it. And in the metrics of really engaging large audiences kind of falls by the wayside. But you are a master of storytelling. So my question to you is, what are some of the ways where we can really reach out to foreign audiences in a storytelling kind of way, you know, because the way Russia and China unfortunately do it is they use technology to mess up our elections. That's kind of how they reach out to foreign audiences. That's in a way, their version of public diplomacy. So I just want to hear from you as an outsider to this field. How would you go about scaling up this practice?
So, I think what you want to be able to do with technology, which is the reverse of what you expect to do with technology, is to humanize. When we humanize the technological experience, it becomes incredibly powerful. If you think about streaming, which has partially humanized broadband, where people are having emotional experiences on the internet. And when I started on the internet, those things didn't exist at all. The fact that people are watching Squid Game all over the world, a Korean piece of programming that becomes the biggest show in the United States, that is public diplomacy. So cultural diplomacy is public diplomacy. What could we create online which foreign powers would allow their people to have access to? I can't say, because that's the way that if they're going to shut down the internet, they're going to shut down the metaverse too, and your portal to the metaverse will be limited to your own local version of this thing. But assuming the metaverse is big enough at this moment and young enough to accommodate full transaction interaction with other cultures, and in the case of something like Iran, I would create some sort of a interactive experience where people could participate in something dramatic that took these ideas and showed them either as art pieces or as dramatic, almost immersive movie-like experiences that people could engage with and then engage with each other. Because when I grew up in the punk era, and the most important thing was, if you got an album, you would share that with somebody else and you would talk about it. People don't talk about music in the way that we did. We talked about the album covers, we talked about the art, we talked about the fashion. Having something in common that you can talk about, for me, is the heart of cultural diplomacy. And when we don't have anything in common, how do we talk? How do we have that conversation? So I would create things online, and I would create things in the metaverse that provoke that kind of interaction. And I would use the subject matter, for instance, of what's happening in Iran right now. And I would make art pieces about that subject. And I would invite people into the metaverse to talk about it. I don't care what side they're on. It doesn't matter. You can have, you can have people who want to repress that in that environment too. Because now you're in an environment like the one we're in, where we can talk to each other honestly, and we're protected. Nobody can do anything to anybody else. But we have this sense of being partnered in space and time. We don't have that at the moment, unfortunately. Yeah.
So we have time just for one question. Engineer.
So my question was about something you were saying with the sort of fire images of knowing that that piece of connection of people would walk right up and take a photo and have that interactive element. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on sort of from a game theory perspective or any of those pieces of what is that piece of connectivity and sort of creating that buy-in when the metaverse is just everywhere. There'll be so many options. So how do you get people to be willing to have that buy-in to an emotional experience, to an experience of building connection across cultures when they could so easily just, go for the fluff that maybe won't provide them that emotional deepness. So what are those ways that you can sort of incentivize or find the things that people will want to immediately go up and take that photo or have that buy-in immediately?
So I don't think you can legislate connectivity, human connectivity, emotional connectivity. I think you can only speak your own truth. And when you speak about something that you have been through directly, and in my case, I was very ill for 4 years. And that experience took me to an understanding of my own mortality, or caused me to face that. When I talk about that in my work, people immediately understand that it's not a synthetic piece of art that's being created. It's being created directly out of my life's experience. I think if we speak from that part of ourselves that's absolutely true, then people respond. People see it, people sense it. And for me, I think the metaverse is an incredible place in which to speak the truth.
Well, David, thank you very much for this mind-expanding conversation. Obviously, we all agree that we're living in a very audience-centric information environment, and it is about how we fulfill people's experiences, and whether it's online, whether it's virtual, whether it's combined, and that will give people meaning, give people connections. And I think we talk a little bit about what might be the metaverse, what that means for public diplomacy. And my biggest takeaway is that this conversation really calls for more experimentation in public diplomacy practices. And I hope that we'll continue with this discussion. And I think our Ameri Prize is a perfect platform for us to explore these very different ideas and how we can take public diplomacy to the next level and offer fresh perspectives to the practice. So thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in future programs.